All right, folks. So I am making a video today to discuss what I think the future of college football should be now that we have all this realignment talk and rumors going about of who's going where. So this is essentially going to show three examples. One, what I think is most likely to happen. Two, what I think would be the smart move. And three, what my personal dream scenario would be. So to get started, let's look at the Big Ten. And I know there's right now talk of FSU and Clemson potentially joining. However, when I think of the most likely scenario, I am seeing University of Miami and North Carolina joining the Big Ten. Essentially, you would have 5 team pods, so 4 different pods, and that would be Michigan, Wisconsin, Michigan State, Illinois, Northwestern in one, Ohio State, Iowa, Minnesota, Indiana, Purdue in another, Penn State, Miami, Maryland, NC, Rutgers, USC, UCLA, Oregon, Washington, and Nebraska are your West Coast teams. And the way that the matchups would go is you would essentially have 8 conference games. So you would play every team in your pod once. You would then play one team from each pod, and you would have your one fixed rivalry matchup. So that's 8 games. The champion from each one of the divisions moves forward into a 14 playoff, and that's how you get your eventual champion crowned. Now, I'll be honest with you. Wisconsin was in the Northwest. Don't even worry about the names, because the truth is that, that's just placeholders. Michigan, however, with Ohio State, would have prevented them from meeting for a conference championship, and I think the Big Ten would really like that. So, therefore, I separated them, and rather than have Wisconsin, Iowa, Minnesota, Illinois, and Northwestern in the West side, we have Ohio State, Iowa, Minnesota, Indiana, and Purdue there. Then you have Michigan, Wisconsin, Michigan State, Illinois, Northwestern in the other division. For the East, you get Penn State, Miami, UNC, Maryland, Rutgers, and you get in the West USC, UCLA, Oregon, Washington, Nebraska. For your rivalries, Michigan obviously plays Ohio State in the big game. Wisconsin gets paired up with Minnesota, so they have their rivalry intact. Michigan State gets paired up with USC. I know Penn State might have been a more logical opponent, but I went with USC just because Spartans, Trojans, and they have a little bit of a history as well. Illinois plays Indiana. Northwestern plays Purdue. Iowa plays Penn State. Miami with UCLA. That's a coast-to-coast, two popular tourist destinations in Miami and LA. And while they haven't played them each other often, they do have one very classic matchup where Miami was supposed to play UCLA in their season opener. Hurricane came through South Florida. Miami then had to play them the very last week of the season, and UCLA was one win away from playing for a championship, and instead Miami upset them that game. So this would essentially be the pairing there. UNC and Oregon, so you have Nike in Oregon, Jordan Brand in UNC. That's the matchup. Maryland gets paired up with Nebraska. I'm sorry, Terp fans. And Rutgers versus Washington. Part of the reason why we put Miami and UNC in here is these two schools really seem to fit, I think, the Big Ten better. They have the AAU designation, which may or may not matter. I don't believe Nebraska has it. And you also have the fact that the Big Ten would then be able to account for the state of North Carolina's leading brand in North Carolina and one of the big 3 in Florida and Miami. Now, moving to what I think would be the smart thing for the Big Ten to do. In this situation, we're not stuck having to keep the teams that we have in the conference. Instead, you see 4 teams got removed. You're like, hey, how could this possibly happen? Well, if 70% of the Big Ten teams vote for this, essentially 13 out of 18, the 4 that would be removed obviously wouldn't work. Wouldn't vote for it. But you have 14 other teams. If 13 of them vote for it, this could get passed through. And essentially we say goodbye to Rutgers, goodbye to Northwestern, who I know is a founding member of the Big Ten, but I don't think they belong or compete in there very well. Then you also say goodbye to Purdue. And finally, you say goodbye to Nebraska, who also feels like a little bit of an odd fit, especially given that West pod where they're going to be stuck in. There's a lot of distance between USC, UCLA, Oregon, Washington, and Nebraska. Now, why did we let go of Purdue? Well, first edition is Notre Dame. And now you have the biggest brand in Indiana. And you also create a true Southern division with Miami, Florida State, UNC, Virginia, Maryland. Stanford gets added in place of Nebraska. So the Big Ten goes into the Bay Area. They get a program that, while not drawing as many eyeballs on TV as, say, Nebraska right now, Stanford still has a very rich both academic and athletic history, and they have a lot of sports beyond football, the non-revenue sports or nonprofit, the sports that don't make any money, where they do really well. And I think that this would be a good way to have that East-West balance even more. So you end up with Michigan, Michigan State, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, Ohio State, Penn State, Notre Dame. What a division right there. And then two cupcakes in Indiana and Illinois, Miami, Florida State, UNC, Virginia, Maryland, and USC, UCLA, Oregon, Washington, and Stanford. Now, for the matchups here, Michigan and Ohio State still paired up. Michigan State now gets paired up with Penn State. Wisconsin is paired up with Washington, less travel. Minnesota is paired up with Maryland, also less travel. And Iowa gets paired up with Illinois. Then we have Notre Dame paired up with USC. You have the ability to now have as well Miami paired up with Stanford, two private institutions. FSU paired up with Oregon. UNC paired up with UCLA, two rich basketball schools. And that's it. That is essentially your matchup. Moving forward, SEC, what should they do? Most likely scenario. Well, with the Big Ten going with Miami and North Carolina, the SEC gets the two programs that have had the most success in the ACC recently, and that being Florida State and Clemson. And I think these two institutions really fit, not just from a geographical standpoint, but I think they would be really nice tie-ins into the SEC and two big brands for them to land. So you have Alabama, LSU, Auburn, Ole Miss, Mississippi State, Georgia, Florida, Tennessee, Kentucky, Vanderbilt, Florida State, Clemson, South Carolina, Virginia Tech, NC State, and Texas, Oklahoma, Texas A&M, Missouri, and Arkansas. Now, I know the SEC doesn't like to add schools, in states that they're already in, but they did it with Texas. I'm sure Florida doesn't want Florida State in there, and I know South Carolina doesn't want Clemson there, but I think they do it just to get, stronger footholds in both of those states. And then they also expand by two states that they're not currently in, that being Virginia and North Carolina. Now, for the matchups, Georgia gets paired up with Clemson due to proximity. Florida gets paired up with FSU, obviously. Tennessee with Alabama, that's a rivalry. Kentucky and South Carolina. Vanderbilt and Ole Miss. Then you have LSU paired up with Arkansas. Auburn with Missouri. Might not be much of a rivalry there. They're both Tigers. SEC has a thing for Tigers at this point, given that they are trying to corner the market on them. They have Auburn, LSU, Clemson, Missouri here. And then we have Mississippi State paired up with Texas A&M. They've been playing themselves a bit in the SEC. Not much of a rivalry, but there's nothing you can do. You got to pair some of these schools up. VTech with Oklahoma and NC State with Texas. We would all agree that that's not, a traditional rivalry either. Moving on to what I think would be the smartest thing for the SEC to do. Just like the Big Ten, someone's getting left out. And I'm sure you all guessed who that was. Sorry, Vandy. I know you're probably a founding member of the SEC, but in this case, the conference, parts ways with the Commodores, and instead you see the additions of West Virginia. We still have Clemson. You have NC State. And now you add two schools. Because remember, the Big Ten would have let go of Nebraska. Well, this is where I think that they fit in even better. Kansas, not a good football school, incredible basketball tradition and history there, and they're a powerhouse in that sport. So I think the Jayhawks get added. And what happens is that the SEC now essentially gets rid of one school in Vanderbilt where they already have Tennessee, and let's face it, the Volunteers are the big institution in that state. But what they do get is 5 new states added to the conference. So suddenly you have a school in West Virginia, you have a school in Nebraska, you have a school in North Carolina, you have a school in Kansas. So I'm sorry, I said 5, I meant to say 4. And then obviously you had Clemson, who's with South Carolina. Matchups would be Alabama paired up with Florida, so you get to preserve that rivalry. Auburn paired up with Georgia. Tennessee paired up with Ole Miss. Kentucky paired up with South Carolina. West Virginia paired up with Nebraska. LSU, they could have been paired up with Texas, but instead, because of Arkansas and Texas, LSU draws Clemson. Ole Miss, as we said, was paired up with Tennessee. Mississippi State gets paired up with Oklahoma, which Missouri and Oklahoma would have made a lot of sense too. However, we have Missouri with Kansas. And last but not least, NC State gets paired up with Texas A&M. Moving on, what happens with those conferences that right now are being poached? Well, the ACC, I think the most likely scenario is you end up with 18 teams. You add UConn mainly for basketball. Their men and women's programs are doing incredibly well. You then also have Tulane, South Florida added to make up for the teams going away, along with Washington State and San Diego State. And what this lets you do is you balance out the West Coast teams so that 4 of their conference games are, in the same area or part of the country. And the great news for them is Notre Dame comes in and saves the conference, because they have their contract deal or TV deal with NBC. So does it really hurt them to possibly join the conference rather than remain independent? Well, not if the dollars aren't being affected, and if you include the fact that some of the talk has been that the 4 buys in the college football playoff are going to go to these Power 4 conferences. So now Notre Dame would be eligible for one of those buys. And they get paired up with Pitt, Syracuse, BC, and UConn. I think this is a very, very favorable conference for Notre Dame to win. You maintain Georgia Tech with SMU, Tulane, and USF, Louisville, Virginia, Duke, Wake Forest, and Stanford, Cal, Oregon State, Washington State, and you add San Diego State so that you expand beyond just Northern California, but also reach into Southern California with a university that just built a brand new football stadium. And a lot of these institutions have strong academics, which fits in nicely with the ACC's other institutions. I think the only one that would maybe be an exception is Washington State. Then the Big 12, likewise, they go into an 18-team league, and what they do is they add Memphis, which I know it's not Pitt, I know it's not Louisville, both of whom they would love to put into this east side, but you get a school in Memphis to play along with West Virginia, Cincinnati, and UCF. You keep Colorado, Kansas, Kansas State, Iowa State, and then you have out west Utah, Arizona, Arizona State, BYU, and I put UNLV instead of Boise State, which I know Boise State's been doing better in football, but I think the city of Las Vegas has a lot of appeal, and being able to, get into that market might make more sense for the Big 12 if they do eventually try to get to 18 to keep up with the ACC. Now, as for what I think is the smart approach for the ACC and Big 12, well, that's a potential combination of the two conferences into one, where you would now have your first real mega conference of 32 teams. And you essentially trade off teams based on geography. So you can see here, Cincinnati gets added here. West Virginia is not available because in the smart scenario, they were added to the SEC, but UCF comes also. Then you see them pick up on the east side Purdue and Northwestern, who were let go by the Big Ten. Same with Rutgers. And you add Tulane, and that's how you get to 16. So Pitt, Purdue, Northwestern, Cincinnati, Syracuse, Rutgers, BC, Connecticut, Virginia Tech, Louisville, Vanderbilt, Tulane, Georgia Tech, Duke, UCF, Wake Forest. Now for the west side of this conference, you would have TCU, Texas Tech, Oklahoma State, Baylor, Iowa State, Kansas State, SMU, Houston, Utah, BYU, Colorado, Cal, and Arizona, Arizona State, Oregon State, and Washington State. And we're done. Now, what's my dream scenario? Well, I don't normally make videos. In fact, this is probably the only one you'll see that I've made because it's just not what I do. However, I saw an article by On3. I'd been working on this just for fun, imagining what I think should be the case. And then On3, there was a report today saying, hey, they're talking about having 10-team conferences. And then Josh Pate talked about it. Well, guess what? If you did a poll, I'd like to think that a majority of fans would say that that's what they would prefer to. Go back to 10-team conferences. Keep it regional. And essentially what was proposed in the On3 is all Power 4 schools plus Notre Dame, which gives you 70. So initially when I was doing, this just for fun as a pet project, I didn't have Wake Forest in the ACC anymore. They were being, moved to a lower tier. Same thing with Vanderbilt. But because of the report that essentially states, hey, all Power 4 schools get granted, entry into this new format, well, Wake Forest, you're back in. And you have an ACC of Miami, Florida State, Clemson, Georgia Tech, Maryland, UNC, Duke, NC State, Wake Forest, and Virginia. Beautiful. So Maryland, welcome back to the ACC. Big Ten, you had to let go of 8 teams here. Obviously, the West Coast ones were easy. Nebraska was easy, but then there were some hard cuts. Northwestern was initially out of here, the way I had in my smart scenario, but I bring them back in, and instead I moved Iowa out, which was tough because Iowa and the Big Ten fits in nicely, but I think they fit in well with the conference that you'll see that they ended up in. So you end up here with Michigan, Michigan State, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Indiana, Ohio State, Penn State, Purdue, Illinois, and Northwestern. No divisions, 10 teams. You play each team once. No conference championship. We go straight into the playoffs because the best team, at the end of the season automatically is the conference champion. The Big East gets back in it in a big way, and they start off by having Notre Dame included, along with Pitt, BC, Syracuse, UCF, who I think was going to leave out, but because of their Big 12 move a couple years ago, now they're eligible to be in this group of 7 by 10 conferences. So the Knights find a home in the Big East. And you have Louisville, West Virginia, Virginia Tech, Rutgers, Cincinnati. Other than UCF, all these schools close to one another. Most of the states touch. So just makes sense. And this conference obviously leans toward Notre Dame heavily, which I think would appeal to the Irish. I could see Louisville, Pitt, West Virginia, Virginia Tech possibly challenging for it. Rutgers coming from the Big Ten, maybe they got stronger there and can make some noise. But I think it's Notre Dame's conference with a few years maybe of Pitt, Louisville, VTech, or West Virginia. Now, this used to be the Big Eight. We have too many bigs. Let's call it the MVP league. So you have Mountain Valley, Plains, and you have Oklahoma, Nebraska, Colorado, Missouri, Kansas, Kansas State, Utah, BYU, Iowa, Iowa State. I love it. Pac-10. Guess what? Not very hard to put together because this is exactly what it was for decades. USC with UCLA, Oregon, Oregon State, Washington, Washington State, Arizona, Arizona State, and Stanford and Cal. Makes sense. The SEC, here we had to remove 6 teams. Some of them, obviously, you saw went elsewhere, but what we end up with is Alabama, Auburn, Florida, Ole Miss, Vandy, who, just like Wake Forest, I had removed from the SEC when I was originally setting this up, but they're back in. Everyone needs a cupcake. This is already murderer's row as is, because you also have Georgia, LSU, then Tennessee, Kentucky, and South Carolina. That's your SEC. Your Southwest Conference is back and headlined by Texas. Similar to Notre Dame in the Big East, this really sets up nicely for Texas, but I can see a lot of these schools, potentially winning the conference from year to year, depending on how Texas does. So you have Texas A&M, Oklahoma State, Houston, SMU, Arkansas is back in the Southwest Conference, Texas Tech, TCU, Baylor, and Mississippi State, who that's the school I had to remove from the SEC when I added Vandy back. And frankly, I think Mississippi State hasn't been able to compete in the SEC as well as they'd like. I think this conference actually gives them a chance to potentially, win a championship here and there. Finally, for the final 12, and this is where things get interesting because you look at this group and you're like, wow, this is not good. And I get it. But the exciting part about this final 12 is you have your 7 conferences of 10 teams. So that's 70 as currently proposed. But now here you have promotion and relegation. And these 12 schools every year are competing just to stay at this upper tier where you can get into the FBS college football playoff. Because every season, you're going to have 4 teams, the bottom 4 teams drop out of here and 4 new teams injected in. So this is essentially the conference of everyone, because all the other institutions that you're going to see on the next slide, they all are playing to get up here with the big boys to try and make it to that college football playoff. And at least one member of this group will be able to get into the college football playoff every season. So that ends up being right now Tulane, South Florida, Memphis, UConn, Eastern Carolina, Rice, San Diego State, San Antonio, UNLV, New Mexico, Boise State, Colorado State. Folks, if your school is not here and they're on this next slide, don't hate me for it. At the end of the day, I'm sure this could change based on the previous season, who performed best, and that would ultimately be the 12. These are just the ones I went with, because then you see that this next group, they're the ones fighting for promotion. And you have a Northeast with Army, Navy, UMass, Temple, Buffalo, Akron, Rhode Island, Maine, New Hampshire, and Delaware, Ohio, Central Michigan, Northern Illinois, Miami, Ohio, Eastern Michigan, Western Michigan, Bowling Green, Ball State, Toledo, Kent State, so essentially the MAC. Marshall gets moved from the MAC to instead the east side of this division, which is them, Liberty, Charlotte, Western Kentucky, James Madison, Old Dominion, App State, Coastal Carolina, Georgia Southern, and Georgia State. Then you have your South with FAU, FIU, UAB, Middle Tennessee, South Alabama, Troy, Jacksonville State, Louisiana Monroe, Louisiana Tech, and this used to be Louisiana Lafayette, but now it's just Louisiana, so the Raging Cajuns. Then you have Tulsa, Sam Houston, UTEP, Southern Miss, Texas State, Arkansas State, North Texas, North Dakota State, South Dakota State, and Northern Iowa. I can't believe I'm getting through all of these, to be honest with you. And this last row should be easy. So Air Force, Hawaii, Fresno State, Wyoming, Utah State, New Mexico State, San Jose State, Idaho, Montana, and Nevada out west. So every year, these guys compete. You have your 5 conference champs, and you also would have 7 other at large. 4 of these get a bye, just like they do in the new proposed college football playoff. And the 4 top teams, so the 4 that make the semifinals, they get automatic entry the next season into that conference of 12 to be able to play for the college football playoff. One other interesting thing could be let the two teams that make the championship automatically get in, and the two teams that lose in the semifinals, maybe they play the third and fourth worst team in some really weird, like not a bowl game, but just a, survive or get put down, and essentially you would be able to play for your spot to remain as the third or fourth worst team in that conference of 12. And then you would have a chance to get that promotion if you're third or fourth. That would make for, I think, an exciting matchup that a lot of people would tune in. So that is it. That is what I think should be the future of college football. I'd love to see the 10 teams come back. Welcome your comments. Am I onto something? Am I off my rocker? What did I possibly say that you agree with? What would you have done differently? Based on how the conferences are set up and which teams go